everybody, welcome. Welcome, it's lovely to see so many of you here. I'd like to begin the afternoon by welcoming Bruce Gray, QC, to Selwyn Heights. Bruce has kindly agreed to come this afternoon to read through the End of Life Choice Bill and answer basic questions around the language of the bill. The purpose of the presentation is to assist in our understanding of the bill, to help us each make our own individual decision on how we will vote in the September elections. Bruce may be known to some of you through his work with the Anglican Church as the legal advisor to the primates of the Anglican Church and Chancellor for the Anglican Diocese of Auckland. As an aside, Bruce was also the Royal Auckland and Grange Golf Club President in 2017 and 2018. For us today, it's his expertise in the law for which we're grateful. Bruce practices in a wide range of areas of civil and public law. As a QC, he demonstrates an excellence in understanding the law. Bruce is not here to debate or offer his personal opinions, but rather to support us in our own understanding as we make our own decisions. So thank you for coming, and Bruce, thank you for coming, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, everybody. Can I just check first, can you hear me? Excellent, excellent. Well, thanks for coming, asking me to come along to talk about this Act. As has been said, and as was said in the promotional material, the Act involves a number of difficult moral and ethical questions, and I don't think it's for me to tell you what I think or what you should think. But I'm very happy to tell you what the Act says so you can understand what are the issues that you want to think about and what your views might be. And can I say it's nice to come here, it's kind of a homecoming. My mother was assistant principal nurse and then principal nurse at the hospital. And through my university days on Sundays, I was a cleaner and dog's body who came and occasionally helped people shower and get dressed and come to enjoy their day in the hospital. So this is not a new place for me, although it is 40-odd, 50-odd years since I was here. But it's kind of a homecoming. Well, there's a lot to cover, so I'll just get straight into it if you will let me. The bill was enacted on the 16th of November 2019, and it provides for, it is enacted, and if a referendum which will be held at the general election yields a positive vote, it will become law. So the decision whether or not it will become law is already provided for in the legislation. In understanding legislation these days, it's important to start at a provision right at the beginning of most pieces of legislation called the purpose of the Act. And helpfully there's one in this case, and it explains that the purpose of the Act is that people who have terminal illnesses. So the starting point is that this is an Act which is only available for people with terminal illnesses. It is not available for people who are simply uncomfortable. And it's available to those who have terminal illnesses and meet certain criteria. And it's intended to give those people the option of lawfully asking for medical assistance to end their lives. And then secondly, to establish a lawful process for helping eligible people to exercise that option. It's a very process-driven piece of legislation. Most of the detail in it is about how things will happen. The moral choices are found in quite a small number of sections in the Act, most of which are found at the very beginning. Now, what is it that people can get? The definition in section 4 is of assisted dying. And that is defined to be the administration by an attending medical practitioner. No one else. Okay, it's only something that can be done by a medical practitioner or an attending nurse practitioner. And they're both attending. In other words, they are people who have previously been engaged by the patient or the person and who have previously been obliged to give some advice and to follow through some of the processes that we will come to learn about as we work our way through the bill. And what they can do is give people medication to relieve that person's suffering by hastening death. So there must be a kind of suffering present before the person qualifies for the administration of the medicine that's provided for in the Act. So attending medical practitioner is defined, and it is that person's medical practitioner. That's where you go to first. The most important provision probably is Section 5. And Section 5 says, meaning of person who is eligible for assisted dying or eligible person. They must be over 18 years of age. They must be a New Zealand citizen or a permanent resident. So we're not providing a service for tourists to come to New Zealand. They must suffer from an illness that is likely to end the person's life within 6 months. Likely. Not might. Doesn't have to be will. But likely means more likely than not. Within 6 months. Fourth is in an advanced state of irreversible decline in physical capability. So you've got to be able to see a decline in physical capability. It's a decline that must be irreversible and it must be advanced. And doctors who are asked to help people will be asked to express opinions about those things and in the end to account for them. Fifth, experiences unbearable suffering that cannot be relieved in a manner that the person considers tolerable. So there must be the presence of suffering which can't be relieved by palliative care or can't be relieved by palliative care in a way that the patient considers tolerable, and that's a subjective test. That's not a test of whether you or I, if we were in the position of the other person, thinks. It's what they think that counts for that question. And then finally, is competent to make an informed decision about the assisted dying. So you're only eligible if you can make up your own mind about whether it's something that you want. People who are no longer able to make up their mind are not eligible for what's available under the legislation. Now, there are a whole bunch of people who might wish to be considered but won't bring themselves within that definition. But for clarification, subsection 2 of section 5 specifies some people who are not eligible. And the first of those are people who are suffering from a mental disorder or mental illness. So you do not qualify by reason of having a mental disorder or a mental illness. You do not qualify by reason of having a disability. And you do not qualify by reason of being of advanced age. So for clarification purposes, the definition of who is eligible specifically exclude those people. And in order to be competent, Section 6 makes further provisions. You must be able to understand information about the nature of the assisted dying that's relevant to the decision, to retain it to the extent necessary to make a decision. So when told, you've got to be able to remember it for long enough to make a proper personal evaluation of the choice that you're about to make. To use or weigh that information as part of the process of making the decision. So you must have the cognitive ability to weigh things against each other, and you must be able to communicate the decision in some way. And that is the test of competence. It's a test of competence that's been drafted having regard to other legislation in countries around the world, Belgium, Canada, Holland, and the like. They've all been reviewed. Couple of checks for health practitioners. Health practitioners can opt out. They can say, I conscientiously object to participating in this process, and it's therefore a service I will not provide you. If one of their patients comes to them and says, I would like to receive the assistance contemplated by the Act, their task is to take you somewhere where you can find an alternative practitioner who will do it for you. As well, at section 10, there's a prohibition against any discussion of assisted dying being initiated by the health practitioner. So the health practitioner must not may not, must not, initiate a discussion or make a suggestion about assisted dying as an option. It is something that the person must initiate for themselves. Now, the process by which it happens is provided for by section 11. And it is that the person who wants to exercise the option must tell their medical practitioner that's what they want. And immediately, the medical practitioner must do a number of things. They must give the person a prognosis for their terminal illness. Because remember, we've got the test that a person must have a terminal illness which is likely to cause their death within 6 months. So the medical practitioner must immediately say, yes, I think you have a condition. I think that condition is terminal, and I think that it's likely to bring about your death within 6 months. If you fail on any of those, the practitioner must tell you and then say to you, I don't think you'll qualify because you're not eligible. Second, the medical practitioner must give an opinion about whether or not the illness is irreversible. No treatment's available to you, I can't help you. And third, the anticipated impact of the assisted dying. The medical practitioner must ensure that the person understands their other options. These are your palliative care options. These are your treatment and management options. These are the other things that are available to you. If you're feeling very down about yourself, this is the help that we can provide you to understand your condition and what might be the value of continuing to live rather than choosing to die. And then the medical practitioner must make sure that the person knows that they can decide at any time to stop the process if it has been initiated, to back out. Tell them that they don't have to talk to anyone else about it, but tell them they may wish to discuss it with their family, and do their best to make sure that a person is free from pressure from anybody else. And that's supported really by another provision in the future that we'll come to look at, section 24, which says if at any time a medical practitioner comes to think that the person seeking assisted dying has been under pressure from anybody else, they must stop the process immediately and it can go no further. So if there are family members or any other people who are exerting pressure, then that is something which, if the medical practitioner comes to know about it, will mean the process stops. Probably could be restarted again, although that's not provided for in the legislation, but it would have to come an end at that point. Now, I said to you that it was a process-rich piece of legislation, and it is. There are a whole bunch of provisions about how a request is made, The medical practitioner has to fill out some forms. They've got to send the forms into a central regulator to collect them. Perhaps the high-level things that you may want to know about is that there's a process of 2 and up to 3 separate medical reports that are required. The first is the attending medical practitioner has to decide that the person's eligible, that they've got the illness, they've got the pain and the like, that they're not a person, either they are or are not a person who are eligible, or alternatively, they're a person who would be eligible if they're competent to make a decision and they can't decide whether the person's competent to make a decision. And then they've got to fill in their form and send it to a registrar who keeps all the forms. The next thing is there must be a second opinion. So you then got to go to another independent doctor whom you haven't seen before, and they're people who are kept on a register that the registrar has of people who are willing to do that, and they've got to reach the same opinion. So they've got to meet you afresh, they've got to read your medical files, they've got to reach the opinion that you're eligible because you're sufficiently unwell and sufficiently likely to die within 6 months, and they say yes. If there's a doubt about whether the person is competent to make a decision, and remember we talked about the test of competence, you've got to be able to receive information, hold it for long enough to make an evaluation, be able to communicate your decision. Then there's provision for a third opinion, which is by a psychiatrist about competence. And that's the test for whether there is competence and qualification. And then the person can choose the time and the place, and within reason the method. There's provision for inhaling and for being injected. There's provision for someone else to administer it or for you to self-administer it as you wish. Protections that ensure that you can back out at any time. And then quite detailed provisions for how things are to occur and the reporting of the death to the registrar, so that the state needs to know exactly what happened and why. I told you earlier that there was section 24, which is a provision that no further action can be taken if pressure is suspected, and it is if at any time the attending medical practitioner or attending nurse practitioner suspects on reasonable grounds that a person who's expressed the wish to exercise the option of receiving assistance to die is not expressing their wish free from pressure from any other person, they must take no further action. So there is that provision. And then at the end of the Act there are some miscellaneous things. One of them is section 35. If you choose to take the option of being assisted to die, the contracts you have made are effective as if you had died of natural causes. That means that life insurance policies will respond. They would not normally in the event of a suicide or participation by a person in their own death. Then at section 36, there's a restriction on making public details of assisted dying deaths. It's a provision which says that no person may make public in respect of any death to which the section applies, the method by which the medication was administered, the place where the medication was administered, and the name of the person who administered the medication. And that's a provision which is drawn from the abortion legislation, and it's intended to protect places and people who help because of the possibility of physical harm to them by protest activity. The issue with it in this case that is controversial is, supposing you had 2 facilities and one had an experience of 20% of their people being assisted to die and the other only 5%. Because of course there are sometimes financial incentives to places like this for people to die and move on, because much of the money is made from the turnover of rooms and villas. Wouldn't you want to know? Isn't that something that would be important to you? Might it not seem to you to be important to know whether one place was just finding itself having more residents who wished to be helped to die than others? So that's a slightly controversial little provision that's tucked away down the bottom.
Excuse me, would you mind repeating that? I couldn't hear you clearly.
Right. Section 35 provides that no one can make public, in respect of any death, the method by which the death occurred, the place where the death occurred, and the name of the person who administered it.
So they can't mention it at funerals, for instance?
No.
Very interesting.
And then, finally, those who do help people to exercise the right that the Act will give to assisted to die are immune from criminal liability for doing so. Now, there were very extensive public submissions to the Justice Select Committee before the bill was reported back to Parliament before the third reading and enactment, and the report of the Justice Select Committee identifies all the moral and ethical issues that people raised with them in the course of the hearings. And I thought it might be useful if I just ran through some of those to tell you what it was that the members of the committee had in mind for you to think about. The starting point is the eligibility criteria. Initially, the bill did not have the eligibility criteria that I read out to you, namely that a person was in an advanced state of irreversible decline in physical capability, experienced unbearable suffering that could not be relieved in a manner that the person considered tolerable, and was competent. And the test instead was that there was a condition which was grievous and irremediable. Grievous, really bad; irremediable, can't be fixed. There was a lot of debate about that definition. It's a definition that's drawn from legislation in some other countries. And the criticisms that were made of it is that examples of conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, chronic pain, cerebral palsy, and heart disease can be brought within the definition of grievous and irremediable condition. And in fact, there's quite a long list. Asthma, diabetes, dementia, incontinence, gluten intolerance, all of them might be serious and unable to be fixed. And so the range of people who might be eligible with that definition is much, much wider than in the definition that now has been included into the Act. So the new definition is drawn from Canadian experience and has become what the Canadian courts and what Canadian legislators have applied. In other words, they've tried to take what was a little bit subjective, a bit diffuse and a bit wide, and make it objective and more focused. So that's the first issue really that the Justice Committee spent a lot of their time on. So other issues that were mentioned, the first and most important that I refer to really is palliative care. Generally the medical profession opposes the bill. You oppose the bill, partly for the ethical reason that doctors say our job is to help people live. We are not about helping people to die. That's not what we do, it's not what we're here for, it's not what we think we're on about. Some doctors who were involved in the provision of palliative care, pain relief, came along and said, yes, that's fine. Mostly, people should not feel pain. Mostly, pain can be managed. But we have to acknowledge that in a small minority of cases, people experience pain which we cannot manage. And for those people, the pain is almost intolerable. And so those doctors were themselves mixed. Some said, notwithstanding that, pain is part of the human experience. Awful, but bits of our lives are awful. For most of us in the course of our lives. Others say no. We think that this is just the ultimate way of helping people deal with pain. Then there are those who are seriously ill but now excluded because they're not likely to die within 6 months and their condition is no longer, is not one of permanent decline. Some of those said, actually, we think this bill will help us live longer. Without this bill, some of us would consider suicide, because we can do that while we still are able to think and to achieve it for ourselves. But if I'm forced to wait and risk getting to the point where I can't do it for myself and can't make my own decision, then I'll do it now. On the other hand, if you enact this legislation so that having someone help me die in the future is available, then I don't need to do something now and I can afford to wait. So in fact, this act will help me live for longer and help me feel more confident about living longer and waiting. Others, as I said, say suffering is part of the human experience and it's not for us to say or to help people to decide to die. The topic of suicide occupied much of the time. New Zealand rates of suicide are high. Suicide in our community is a problem. Many who are concerned about suicides, including among young people and among Māori and Pacific people, say we don't want this legislation enacted because it supports the proposition that some lives are not worth living. And we think that it supports the choice some people make to take their lives when we'd like to think for them it might not be necessary. Some Māori said, Māori tikanga, Māori values incorporate holistic models of health. Some submitters referred to the maxim te whare tapa whā, where there are 4 balanced aspects to life: physical health, spiritual health, family connections, and mental health. Probably speaking in much the same way as those who had submitted that discomfort, great pain, suffering is part of the human experience. So that's a topic which has been identified by the Justice Select Committee in its report as one about which people will have different views and will make up their own minds. Some submitters focused their attention on personal autonomy. We are each sovereign. We are each capable of making up our own minds about what to do with our bodies and our lives, and it is not for anyone else, including the community at large, to tell us what to do. Some focused on dignity. You might be able to live with a degree of suffering that's simply not acceptable to me. My dignity requires that I'm not obliged to put up with something that's simply too much for me. Again, a moral and ethical issue. There's some writings about the place of compassion. Some submitters were concerned about commercialisation of the dying process and concerned about the nature of the transaction where people and organisations can make money from helping others to die. The question of coercion clearly was of concern to a number of people. And the flip side of it, the fear of becoming a burden to others. And just what is the burden of a person near the end of their life, whether elderly or much younger. And then there were the faith-based submissions, and almost all of those opposed the legislation on grounds of inconsistency with their faith, that life is God-given and it's not for humans to make a decision about when it should end. That life is sacred and has a sanctity. So that's an overview really of the range of issues that was the subject of evidence to the Justice Select Committee. The Justice Select Committee didn't vote on these things. It didn't express a combined view. The members of the committee all had different views, and so the report of the committee simply recorded the range of discussions and submissions back to Parliament so that Parliament could have regard to them when the members decided whether or not to vote for the bill as it was and to make it an act. If any of you are concerned to read, you can go onto the Parliament website to the reports of the Justice Select Committee, and you will find there that actually all of the submissions made are linked and can be printed out, downloaded and printed out and made available so you can read them in due course, and the report of the committee is too. So if you want to take a bit more time, I've really given you quite a brief overview of the topics. If you want to read them in more detail and read what the committee itself said, then they can be found there. So that's about the 30 minutes I was going to talk for, but we've left 15 or 20 minutes for questions if you have any. I commend the Act to you. Have a read of it, and I commend to you for your thought all of the moral and ethical questions that underlie it.